Have you ever witnessed something that made you believe in the power of pure, unconditional loyalty? Something so incredible that it made you question the boundaries of courage and compassion? This is the story of a stray dog who did the unthinkable, a dog that went beyond survival instincts to save a human life, against all odds. It was just another ordinary day in a bustling city, where the streets were alive with noise, movement, and the rush of everyday life. People hurried by, too absorbed in their own worlds to notice the struggles that happened right in front of them. Among the crowd, there was a stray dog, often overlooked, walking alone like so many others in the city. Covered in dirt and a little thinner than most, this dog didn't have a name, didn't belong to anyone, but had a heart full of resilience. But on this particular day, something would change. The dog's routine, the typical life of survival, would intersect with something far greater, something that would not only change the life of the dog, but of a complete stranger who had no idea the dog was about to become his hero. It was a typical morning when the man, unaware of the looming danger, found himself on the streets as usual. He was focused, walking through the same familiar path he'd taken countless times. Maybe the world seemed a little quieter that day, or maybe it was just a random turn of fate. Whatever it was, in the blink of an eye, something happened that would alter the course of the day forever. Out of nowhere, a sudden threat emerged, an unexpected danger that none of the bystanders could foresee. People scattered in panic, unsure of what was happening. But through the chaos, the stray dog, this nameless creature with no ties, no claim to anyone, was the first to notice the man in trouble. What happened next is something that feels almost too unbelievable to be true. This stray dog, who had never known the comfort of a home, who had no reason to care for anyone, acted with more bravery and selflessness than most could ever imagine. Without hesitation, it ran towards the man, who was moments away from becoming a victim of something far worse. As the situation spiraled, the dog took action. What could drive a stray to take on such a huge risk? Was it pure instinct, or something deeper, a sense of empathy that transcends everything we understand about animals? But just as the danger seemed to subside, and everything appeared to settle back into its regular rhythm, a new twist emerged. The dog had saved the man, but now, its life was on the line. The man, who had been a complete stranger just moments before, now stood at the crossroads of a decision that would change everything. What would he do? Would he repay this act of courage, or would he walk away like everyone else had before? And would the dog ever understand the significance of what it had done? There was no going back now. The bond that had been formed in that instant of danger was not easily broken. But what would the future hold for both the man and the stray dog? How would their paths intertwine from here on out? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. What happens next is a journey of loyalty, courage, and an unexpected friendship that will challenge everything you know about loyalty and love. You won't want to miss the incredible turn this story takes as we dive deeper into what happens after this unforgettable act of heroism. The dog stood there, its coat matted with dirt, and its eyes wide, full of a wild, yet almost human-like intensity. It was panting, a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline, but it didn't leave the man's side. The chaos around them slowly began to settle, but the tension in the air didn't lift. People had gone back to their daily routines, whispering among themselves, unsure of what they'd just witnessed. But not the man. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away from the dog that had just saved his life. He had never seen it before, nor had anyone else. This was a city where people were used to the sight of stray animals, wandering the streets and searching for scraps. Most people barely noticed them, quick to avoid eye contact or to cross the street. But today, this dog wasn't like the others. There was something about it, something in the way it stood, waiting for him to move, as though it were daring him to make the next move. The man's heart still raced from the danger he had just escaped. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself. He looked down at the dog, unsure of what to do. Could this be real? Was he still in some sort of shock from what had happened moments ago? But no, the dog was still there, its eyes locked with his, and it seemed to be waiting for him to make next move. For a moment, he considered walking away. People did it all the time, ignored the strays, let them fend for themselves. He was no different from anyone else who had seen the countless dogs on the streets, too tired or too preoccupied to care. But this dog had just given him something he could never repay. It had risked its life for him, with no expectation of anything in return. As he stood there, the sounds of the city rushing by, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story didn't end with the dog saving him. It wasn't just an act of bravery. No, there was more to it. Something deeper, something that felt almost fated. The dog had been alone just like him. He, too, had lived much of his life in isolation, surrounded by people but never truly connected to anyone. His job, his life, everything had become routine. He had built walls around himself, keeping his emotions in check, keeping the world at arm's length. And yet, here was this dog, a creature with no home, no future, no security, yet it had done something remarkable. It had seen him in danger, and without a moment's hesitation, it had acted. Why? Was it simply instinct? Or was there something more? The dog didn't know him anything. So why, out of all the people on that crowded street, had it chosen him to save? The man's thoughts raced as he looked at the dog, still standing in front of him. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling. He knew that something had changed between them. It wasn't just about a quick moment of bravery, it was something more profound, something neither of them could explain. And yet, deep down, he could feel that whatever it was only just beginning. But what happened next was even more perplexing. The dog, after saving the man's life, seemed almost hesitant. It didn't approach him any closer. Instead, it took a few steps back, looking around cautiously, as though it were waiting for something. The man felt a surge of uncertainty. Should he reach out to it? Should he thank it? But there was a barrier between them now, something unspoken. The dog was still a stray, after all. And for all the courage it had shown moments ago, it was still a creature bound by the survival instincts of a life lived on the streets. For a few seconds neither of them moved. The world seemed to have paused, the noise of the city fading into the background. The man could see the dog's eyes scanning the street, always alert, never fully relaxed. It was as if it knew something he didn't. There was a hidden layer to this moment, something he couldn't quite place. Then, without warning, the dog turned and trotted away, disappearing into the shadows of a nearby alley. The man stood frozen for a moment, still processing what had just happened. He felt a strange pull to follow it, to somehow find a way to repay the dog. But the crowd around him had already resumed their normal pace, walking by as though nothing had happened. He couldn't let this feeling go, though. He knew that something was not finished, not resolved. The dog had disappeared, but the question lingered in his mind. What was the dog running from? What would happen next? The man, still in a state of shock, found himself walking aimlessly down the street, unsure of what to do next. His mind replayed the moments leading up to the dog's intervention. The strange look in its eyes, the way it had seemed to understand the danger, the urgency of the situation. It was almost as if the dog had known something about him, something he hadn't even fully realized about himself. The further he walked, the more he thought about what had just happened. He couldn't shake the image of the dog the way it had stayed with him, without asking for anything. But the bigger question remained, why had it saved him? What had driven this creature, a stray with no real home, to risk everything for someone it had never met? And as the evening drew near, the man couldn't help but feel like he hadn't seen the last of the dog. Somehow, in some way, their paths would cross again. As the days passed, the man found himself restless, unable to shake the strange connection he had felt with the dog. He tried to return to his normal life, but everything felt different. The streets no longer seemed just like streets, the people didn't seem like mere faces in the crowd. His mind kept drifting back to that one defining moment, the dog's unwavering loyalty and its bold act of courage. What was it about this dog that had drawn him in? He had seen countless animals on the streets before, each one struggling in its own way to survive, to get by. But this dog had done more than just survive. It had acted on a deep, raw instinct, driven by something greater than mere hunger or fear. It had stepped into the chaos without hesitation, risking its own safety to protect a stranger. It was as if the dog understood something about him that he had never even understood about himself. The man tried to let go of the feeling. He had other things to focus on: work, his daily routine, but no matter how hard he tried, the thought of the dog lingered, following him like a shadow. Each time he walked down that same street where it had happened, he found himself looking over his shoulder, hoping for another glimpse, hoping that somehow their paths would cross again. But the dog was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, the dog was facing a struggle of its own. It wasn't just a nameless stray anymore. It had become something more, a silent hero, carrying the weight of its own actions. The streets it once roamed with ease had become unfamiliar, more dangerous than before. The dog had done what it could in that moment to save the man, but in doing so, it had made itself a target. Its intervention hadn't gone unnoticed. In the city, there were those who preyed on the weak, those who didn't take kindly to outsiders, especially a stray dog that dared to interfere with their plans. There were whispers among the people in the area, some of them who had seen what had happened and some who hadn't. The dog's act of courage had caught the attention of others, people who ran the streets in ways that most never saw. These were the ones who made the rules in the shadows, the ones who operated in the darkness. The stray, in their eyes, had overstepped its place. The man it had saved, the one they had seen walking away unscathed, was of no consequence to them. But the dog, this unkempt creature that had interfered in their world, was a different matter. The dog didn't know who they were, but it could sense their presence. It had been a stray for so long that it had learned to trust its instincts. And its instincts now told it that something was off. The world around it had grown tense, more unpredictable. The alleyways that had once been safe were now filled with danger. The shadows weren't just places to rest, they were places to hide, places to keep out of sight, places where threats loomed closer than ever before. Back on the other side of the city, the man couldn't shake the feeling that the dog needed him. He tried to go about his life as usual, but there was an unspoken bond that had formed between them, and it kept pulling him back to that moment, to that street, to that dog. It was as though the dog's courage had created an invisible thread that connected them, a thread that refused to break. He tried asking around, talking to a few people in the neighborhood, but nobody seemed to know anything about the stray. Some didn't even remember what had happened that day, while others just shrugged it off. But there was one woman, an elderly neighbor, who looked at him strangely when he mentioned the dog. She told him she had seen it before. She called it that brave creature but warned him not to get too involved. She spoke with an edge in her voice, as if there was something more she knew, something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. The man's curiosity only deepened. He couldn't understand what was so special about the dog, or why it seemed to have stirred up so much attention. But one thing was clear: he wasn't the only one who was interested in the dog. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the stray's life was in danger. It had risked everything for him, and now, he had to find a way to return the favor. Determined to learn more, the man set out early the next morning, retracing his steps to the spot where he had first encountered the dog. The street was quiet, the air still. He looked up and down, hoping for some sign, some hint that the dog might be nearby. He walked further, his eyes scanning the alleys, the shadows, but there was nothing. He started to wonder if maybe he had imagined it all. Maybe the dog hadn't really been as special as he thought. Maybe it was just an act of random heroism, a moment that would soon be forgotten. But then, as he turned a corner, he caught sight of something, a flash of movement in the alley ahead. His heart raced. Could it be? He walked faster, his footsteps echoing through the narrow passageways. The figure moved again, a flash of fur darting behind a dumpster. His breath caught in his throat. This time, he was sure. The dog was here. But as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The dog was crouched low, its eyes wide, as if it were watching for something. The tension in the air was palpable. The man stepped closer, his heart pounding, but before he could call out, the dog turned and vanished into the shadows. The man hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. His instincts told him to follow, but something about the dog's behavior, its wariness, made him pause. What was it running from? Why had it seemed so alert, so on edge? Before he could make up his mind, a sudden noise behind him made him freeze. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly toward him. It wasn't the dog. It was someone else, someone whose presence made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The man couldn't see the figure's face clearly, but the air around him suddenly felt thick with danger. Something told him that whatever was happening now was only the beginning and that the dog's role in this story was far from over. The figure moving toward the man didn't say a word, but its presence was enough to send a chill down his spine. The air felt heavier, as if the entire city had paused, waiting for something. The man's heart raced in his chest, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He had no idea who or what this person was, but one thing was clear: he was not alone. And he had a sinking feeling that the stray dog's troubles were far from over. The figure stepped closer, the shadows now obscuring its face, but the man could see the silhouette of a worn leather jacket and boots, the kind that blended into the darkness. The stranger didn't seem in any rush, taking deliberate steps as if he knew the man wouldn't dare to run. His eyes never left the man, and despite the silence, there was an undeniable tension in the air, a sense of looming danger. "What do you want?" the man finally managed to say, his voice shaky but firm. The figure paused for a moment, seemingly considering the question. Then, in a low voice that sent a shiver through the man, he spoke. "The dog. Where is it?" The man's pulse quickened. It was clear now that the stranger wasn't here by coincidence. Whoever this was, they knew about the dog, and their interest was more than casual. The man took a step back, his mind racing. He didn't know what was going on, but something deep inside told him that the danger wasn't just to the dog, it was to both of them. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man replied, trying to sound convincing, though he knew it wasn't true. He had seen the dog. He had felt the connection. He couldn't just pretend it didn't matter. The figure's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Don't lie to me. We know you saw it. We know you talked to it." His voice grew darker, more menacing. "You think you can just walk away from this?" The man's mind raced. What was he being dragged into? Who were these people, and why were they so focused on a stray dog? Every instinct told him that this was more than just a coincidence. The dog had been caught in something far bigger than either of them. Suddenly, the air shifted. A sound echoed through the alley, a faint rustling, like the crackle of leaves underfoot. The man froze, his gaze darting to the shadows, trying to locate the source. The stranger noticed it too, his eyes narrowing, his posture becoming even more alert. Without warning, the dog appeared again. It was a blur of motion, faster than the man could react, pushing past him and barreling into the alley. It was as if the dog had sensed the danger, knowing that its presence was the key to everything. The man couldn't help but feel a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The dog stopped in front of him, its body tense, ears flat against its head, as it growled low in its throat. The stranger took a step forward, his hand moving toward his jacket. For a moment, it seemed as if time had frozen. The dog, though small and seemingly unremarkable, was standing its ground, guarding the man like a protector, its instincts sharper than ever. "What's going on?" the man muttered, his voice trembling. He didn't know who the stranger was, but the dog was telling him one thing: don't trust him. The man's heart pounded as the stranger slowly pulled something from his jacket, something shiny. A knife. The glint of the blade caught the dim light from the street lamp above, and the man's stomach twisted in fear. The stranger wasn't just looking for the dog. He had come for it, and the man was in his way. For a moment, the man stood frozen, torn between fear and a sense of responsibility toward the dog. The stray had saved his life, and now it was his turn to protect it. But how? He was no fighter, no hero. He had never been in a situation like this. The stranger's eyes flicked from the dog to the man, as if assessing whether it was worth dealing with him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cold, almost pitying. "That dog is a problem. And you don't want to be part of this." The words hung in the air like a warning, but the man's resolve was beginning to harden. There was no going back now. The dog had chosen him, and he wasn't about to let it fall into the hands of someone like this. Before he could act, the dog lunged forward, snapping its jaws at the stranger's arm. The man's heart leapt in his chest, but the stranger was fast. He jerked back, swiping the knife through the air. The dog barely dodged, its fur grazing the sharp edge of the blade. A bead of blood formed along its side, but the dog didn't retreat. It only became more determined, its eyes fierce, its body ready for the next strike. The man felt a surge of adrenaline. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let the dog fight this battle alone. He lunged toward the stranger, knocking his arm just as he was about to strike again. The blade sliced through the air, missing both of them by inches, but the impact was enough to throw the man off balance. They both stumbled, but the dog remained focused, its growl echoing through the alley. For a split second, it seemed as if the whole world had stopped. The dog, the man, the stranger, they were all locked in this tense, life or death standoff, and it was unclear who would make the next move. The man's heart was racing in his chest, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had no plan, no idea what he was doing, but all he knew was that he couldn't back down now. He had to protect the dog. The stranger took a step back, a twisted smile creeping onto his face. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice laced with menace. "This isn't something you can fix. It's bigger than both of you." The dog's growl deepened, and the man stood tall, trying to steady his breath. He didn't know what he was up against, but one thing was clear: the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and the real battle was just beginning. The stranger's smile twisted further, a cruel glint in his eyes. He wasn't just here for the dog, he was here for something bigger, something the man still couldn't understand. He could feel the tension building in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm waiting to break. And then, just as the man was about to make a move, there was a sharp sound that sliced through the stillness: footsteps. Not one set. Several. The man froze. The stranger's eyes narrowed, but his smile didn't fade. It was as if this new development was exactly what he'd been waiting for. From the darkness of the alley came more figures, their silhouettes becoming clearer with each passing second. The sound of boots on the pavement grew louder, until finally, a group of people emerged from the shadows, all moving with an eerie, almost rehearsed precision. The man's stomach dropped. They weren't just strangers anymore. These people were part of something much larger. The dog had been right to be on edge. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was organized. And now, the man was in the middle of it. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the dog with a predatory gleam. He was tall, with a cold, calculating expression, and his voice carried an authority that immediately made the man's blood run cold. "You've made a mistake, friend," the man said, his voice smooth and unsettling. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The words didn't make sense at first. The man's mind was still processing the sight of the new arrivals, but there was no mistaking the threat in their posture. They weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take control. The dog, sensing the shift in power, bared its teeth, growling louder, but it seemed to know that it couldn't fight all of them. Its stance remained defensive, but it was clear that it was outnumbered and outmatched. The man felt a surge of panic flood through him. He hadn't signed up for this. He was just trying to get on with his life, to repay a debt he didn't even know how to begin to repay. Now, it seemed like that debt was pulling him deeper into a situation he couldn't control. "Who are you?" the man demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "What do you want with the dog?" The leader chuckled darkly, as if the question was laughable. "It's not about the dog. Not really. It's about what it knows." The man's mind raced. What could a stray dog possibly know? What had it gotten itself involved in? And why was this group so desperate to find it? Before he could ask more, the leader snapped his fingers, and two of the figures stepped forward, flanking the man and blocking his escape. They moved quickly, like trained professionals, not giving him any space to move. He was trapped, surrounded by a group of people who seemed to have every exit covered, and a dog that was clearly out of its depth, no matter how brave it had been. One of the newcomers pulled something out of their jacket, a small device, almost unnoticeable in the dim light. It buzzed for a moment, and the leader's eyes flashed with interest. "There we go," he said, his voice tight with excitement. "It's working." The man's confusion deepened. "What's working? What are you doing with that?" But the leader didn't answer him. Instead, his eyes never left the dog, who was still trying to stay alert, its fur bristling, its gaze darting from person to person. The device in the newcomer's hand emitted a soft hum, and then the leader smiled again, this time, a smile that was both satisfied and predatory. "You see," the leader said, finally turning his attention back to the man. "This dog isn't just any stray. It's carrying something important. And now so are you." The man's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's in it? What's the dog carrying?" But the leader only shook his head. "You wouldn't understand. Not yet. But trust me, you'll wish you had stayed away." The tension was unbearable. The dog wasn't just a stray, it was part of something far more dangerous, far more complicated than anything the man had ever imagined. The device, the strange group, the leader's cryptic words, it all pointed to something bigger, something that was unfolding right in front of him, and he was right in the middle of it. Before the man could process this new revelation, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. A low rumble echoed through the alley. It was distant at first, but then it grew louder, reverberating off the walls around them. The dog's ears perked up, its body stiffening. The man felt a strange, gnawing sense of dread. Something was coming. Out of the corner of his eye, the man caught a glimpse of movement. Another figure emerged from the shadows, but this one wasn't part of the group. This one wasn't human at all. The dog's reaction was immediate. It barked in warning, but the man could barely process what he was seeing. The new figure, large and dark, loomed in the alley, its features still obscured in the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it stepped into the light, revealing its true form. The dog wasn't the only one with a mysterious past. The figure that had appeared now stood before them, a silhouette that no one could mistake for anything ordinary. It was something more, something that made the other figures freeze in place. The dog didn't just know something, it had been guarding something far more dangerous than anyone realized. And now, with this new player entering the scene, the stakes had just been raised beyond anything the man could have ever expected. Everything that had led up to this moment, the dog's actions, the strange group, the cryptic words, had all been building to this. And now, the man realized, he was not just in danger. He was part of something that was about to explode, and there was no turning back. The real fight had just begun. The figure that had emerged from the shadows was not human. It was something the man could barely comprehend, tall, broad, and cloaked in an unsettling aura of darkness. Its eyes glowed with an eerie intensity, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. The group surrounding the man tensed, their expressions shifting from smug confidence to fear. The leader's eyes widened, and for the first time, the man saw a crack in the mask of control. The dog, growling louder than ever, was no longer just reacting to the situation, it was on high alert, its body rigid, its stance ready. The creature in front of them, whatever it was, posed an entirely new threat. The man could feel it, too. There was something otherworldly about the figure, something far more dangerous than anything he had faced up until now. The leader took a step back, his earlier cocky demeanor fading as he seemed to calculate his next move. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered, almost to himself, as his eyes darted between the dog and the new figure. The creature's gaze swept across the alley, locking onto the leader. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing second. The dog, sensing an even greater danger, took a defensive step in front of the man, its growls intensifying. The stranger, for all his bravado, wasn't as confident now. His body was tense, as though he knew something was coming, something bigger than him. The man's heart pounded. He didn't know who this figure was or what it wanted, but he knew one thing: the situation had escalated beyond his control. He had been trying to protect the dog, but now it seemed like he was being dragged into a much darker web of secrets and danger. The new figure moved, its massive form silently gliding across the ground. As it drew closer, the others scattered, retreating into the shadows, unwilling to confront whatever this thing was. The leader stepped back, his eyes wild with fear, but he didn't speak. His group had already dispersed, unwilling to risk their lives. The dog's stance softened, sensing the shift in power, but it remained alert, its eyes never leaving the figure in front of them. And then, the unexpected happened. With a movement too fast for the man to track, the creature reached down and scooped the dog up into its arms. The man gasped, thinking it was about to harm the animal, but the creature simply held the dog carefully, its eyes scanning the alley as if it were searching for something or someone. The dog, for the first time, went still, its posture less tense. It didn't bark or growl. Instead, it looked directly at the figure, almost as though it recognized it. The man's breath caught in his throat. "What are you doing with it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The creature didn't answer at first. It just stood there, the dog gently cradled in its arms. And then, after what felt like an eternity, it spoke in a voice that seemed to reverberate through the air itself, low and heavy with ancient knowledge. "This dog is not just any stray. It is a guardian, a protector of secrets that you were never meant to uncover." The words hit the man like a punch to the gut. He stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. "Guardian of secrets? What are you talking about?" The creature's eyes glowed brighter, as though it were trying to pierce into the very core of him. The dog was never just an innocent animal. It was chosen. It has been protecting something that cannot fall into the wrong hands. And now you are involved. The man's mind raced. He thought back to everything that had happened, the strange figures, the cryptic words, the device that had hummed with a life of its own. But none of it made sense. Why him? Why the dog? The creature took a step closer, lowering the dog back to the ground. "You are not here by accident," it said. The dog led you to this moment because you are the key. Whether you like it or not, you are tied to this fate. Before the man could process this, the creature raised its hand, and suddenly the entire alley was filled with a low, rumbling vibration. A shimmer appeared in the air, a crackling energy that seemed to distort reality itself. The ground beneath them trembled, and the man had to fight to stay on his feet. It was as if the world was splitting open, revealing something hidden just beneath the surface. The dog stepped forward, its eyes locked onto the man with an intensity that was almost human. And in that moment, the man understood. The dog wasn't just protecting the secrets, it was protecting him. The creature, still holding its gaze on the dog, spoke again, its voice a mix of warning and command. You have no idea what you've unleashed. This is bigger than any of us. The dog has been guarding a force, an ancient power that has been hidden away for centuries. And now, it is awake. You were never supposed to know about it. The man's head spun. His life had been ordinary routine, predictable. But now, he was standing at the center of something that felt like it had been set in motion long before he had ever stepped into this alley. The dog barked once, as if urging him to act, to do something. The creature looked down at the dog, then back at the man, its expression unreadable. And then, in an instant, everything changed. The shimmering energy around them surged, and the ground split wide open, revealing a dark, swirling vortex beneath their feet. The air thickened, the noise around them deafening as the world seemed to unravel. The dog turned and ran toward the vortex, the creature following swiftly behind it. The man hesitated, unsure if he should follow or flee, but something in his gut told him this was the moment where everything would either break or change forever. With no more time to think, he stepped forward, drawn by the pull of the dog, the strange figure, and the secrets that were now becoming too real to ignore. As he approached the edge of the vortex, the dog glanced back at him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. An unspoken understanding passed between them. And then, just before he could take another step, the vortex exploded in a blinding flash of light, leaving the man standing in the empty alley, the echoes of a world that no longer existed ringing in his ears. The dog, the creature, the power, everything was gone, leaving him to face the question that lingered in the air. Had he just witnessed the beginning of something far greater than he could ever comprehend? And in the distance, far beyond the alley, the faintest sound of a dog's bark echoed. The light from the vortex faded into the darkness, leaving the man alone in the alley, his heart still racing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the portal had been, trying to make sense of everything. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. What had just happened? Where had the dog gone? And what was that creature really? For the first time in his life, the world seemed to be full of mysteries far beyond his understanding, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed the beginning of something much larger than himself. The alley was quiet now, almost unnervingly so. The faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves of nearby trees were the only sounds that broke the silence. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. The man could feel it. The events of the past hours had changed him. He wasn't the same person he had been when he walked into this alley, looking for nothing more than an easy way out of his mundane existence. He was different now. And somehow, he knew that nothing in his life would ever be ordinary again. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His thoughts went back to the dog. What had it meant when it ran into the vortex? Why had it trusted him? He had only known the dog for such a short time, yet it had chosen him, pulled him into a web of danger and mystery that had seemed to be waiting for him all along. That bond, whatever it was, felt deeper than anything he had experienced before. It was then that he noticed something strange in the air around him. A faint, shimmering trail that seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't quite describe. It was almost as though the alley itself was alive with some unseen force. The air felt heavier now, as though the world had shifted just slightly, the edges of reality slightly blurred. He stepped forward, instinctively following the trail. It led him deeper into the heart of the city, through winding streets and alleyways, until he arrived at a place he hadn't noticed before, a small, seemingly ordinary shop tucked between two larger buildings. The windows were covered in dust, and the door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled old, filled with the faint scent of books and something he couldn't place, something that made his skin tingle. There, sitting behind the counter, was an old woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him. She didn't look surprised to see him, though he had never been in this part of the city before. She simply nodded, as though she had been expecting him. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "I know what you've been through." He hesitated, still trying to process everything that had happened. But something about her presence made him feel calm, as though she held the answers he had been seeking. Slowly, he stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. "Sit down," she instructed, gesturing to a chair across from her. "We have much to discuss." He sat, watching her closely as she regarded him with a knowing look. She wasn't like the others. She didn't seem frightened, or even concerned. She just seemed aware. "The dog you met," she began, her gaze softening. "It's not just a dog. It is the guardian of an ancient power, something that has been hidden from the world for centuries. The creature you saw, the one that took the dog, was not an enemy. It was a protector, a guide. But the true danger lies in the power that has been unleashed. That power, when it is fully awakened, can change everything." The man leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What power? What are you talking about?" The old woman smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting for him to ask the question. "You are part of a story that goes back much further than you realize. The dog was never just guarding itself, it was guarding you. You are the key to what is to come. And now that the vortex has opened, there is no turning back." She paused, letting her words sink in. The world has always been full of mysteries. But some mysteries, some secrets, are too dangerous to remain hidden. The dog's mission was to protect you from those who would misuse this power. But now, the time has come for you to understand it. The man felt a chill run down his spine. Everything she was saying seemed so unreal, but he couldn't deny the weight of her words. He had seen the evidence with his own eyes: the vortex, the creature, the strange energy that had surrounded him. He had felt it all, deep in his bones. "What does this mean for me?" he asked quietly. "What am I supposed to do?" The old woman leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see right through him. "It means that you must decide. The dog chose you for a reason, and now you must decide whether you will take up the mantle that has been thrust upon you. You have a choice. You can walk away from it all, return to your life, and pretend nothing has changed. Or you can step into the role you were meant to play, the protector of this power, the guardian of the secrets that have been hidden for so long." The weight of her words settled over him, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. What was he supposed to do? He had never asked for any of this. He had just wanted a normal life, to escape the monotony, to escape the mundane. But now, everything had changed. And deep down, he knew that there was no going back. "I don't know if I can do it," he admitted, his voice shaky. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this." The old woman's gaze softened. "None of us ever do, at first. But that is the nature of this power. It chooses not based on strength, but based on something deeper. It chooses those who can carry the weight of the world without losing themselves. And that is what you must learn. You don't need to have all the answers right now. You just need to make the choice." The man sat in silence, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, and though part of him wanted to run, to turn away from everything and leave it all behind, he knew, deep in his heart, that he couldn't. This wasn't something that could be ignored. The world was changing, and he was a part of that change. There was no escaping it. Finally, he stood, looking the old woman in the eye. "I'll do it," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I'll protect it." A small, approving smile crossed the woman's face. "Good," she said. "Then your journey has only just begun." And just like that, the man's life was no longer his own. He had stepped into a world of secrets, power, and responsibility that he had never imagined. But with the dog by his side, and the knowledge that he had a purpose now, he felt a sense of resolve he hadn't known was possible. As he left the shop and stepped back out into the city, the weight of his new reality pressed down on him. The streets seemed quieter now, the world less familiar. But the sense of purpose in his chest was undeniable. The dog had led him to this moment, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of barking again. It was as though the dog was calling to him, guiding him forward into the unknown. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. And with that, the story came to its conclusion, full of mystery, power, and the timeless bond between protector and protected. The man had chosen his path, and now, there was no turning back. The dog had saved a life, and in doing so, had set in motion a new chapter, one that would unfold in ways either of them could yet imagine. But as the man looked out into the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning.